Well, hello. Welcome back to Still Becoming, the show that still lets you know you can still become. You're just at that point where everybody thinks that, oh, you're getting older. Time to forget about anything you wanted to accomplish or any PRs that you might think you can set later in life. And I'm here to tell you, yeah, you can still become. That's what the show's about. I thank you all for joining again. I appreciate everybody out there that's listening and tuning in and hopefully feeling inspired to keep still becoming. You can go get that thing that you have always felt you had a passion about, but were too afraid to share it and explore it. And I'm here to tell you, so what? If you want to follow along on my journey, I will say you can tune in to Instagram at stillbecoming26. There you'll find all of my little, tidbits and, little information about how my workouts went. And, it's not perfect, but that's what it's about. You're still exploring, you're still becoming. And so let's get into it. Why not? Let's find out. There are questions I think we ask ourselves way too often. I know I do. What if I can't? What if I try and fail? What if I'm not good enough? What if I put everything into this and it still doesn't work? And lately I've been thinking about how much time I spend trying to answer those questions before I ever give myself the opportunity to find out. I also think you guys, out there probably felt that same dilemma too. You know, and we want certainty. We want proof. We want somebody to tell us, yes, if you go down this road, everything is going to work out. But life doesn't really work like that. Most of the things that end up meaning something to us begin without certainty. They begin with a question. Can I do this? And maybe, the answer doesn't need to be something huge and, confident, some confident declaration. Maybe the answer can simply be, why not? Let's find out, really. Let's find out. What's the worst that's going to happen? I've been thinking about this a lot in my own life. There was a time when I approached things with a little more curiosity and less calculations. I didn't exactly, I didn't know exactly how difficult, it was going to become. I didn't know all the ways I could fail. And strangely enough, not knowing sometimes made things so much easier for me. I love when I just go into something and I may know what it's about, but I don't know what the result is. I can kind of turn that switch off. Well, you've done this, you've done that. It should lead to that. But being able to shut that part of my brain off and just let's just find out. It feels great. Because instead of, you know, standing at the beginning trying to predict the entire journey, I would just feel like let's just go. See what's going to happen. Then somewhere along the way, through experience, it's changed. It changes us, it changes me. And the experience is a good thing, mind you. I think it teaches us, it helps us, make smarter decisions. It shows up what works and what doesn't. But experience can also create something, else that I personally have been, working on lately and trying to get back to this. Let's find out, and that's expectation. Once you've been through something difficult, you know what difficult feels like. Once you've failed, you know what failure feels like. Once you've been hurt, disappointed, embarrassed, or defeated, your mind remembers that. It remembers all of it. And next time you stand in front of something challenging, your brain starts running calculations. Remember what happened last time. I know you remember that. You know how hard things get. You know how much this hurts. And suddenly you aren't approaching the opportunity that is actually in front of you. You're approaching every previous experience at the same time. That's when curiosity starts disappearing. Instead of asking, what could happen? We start telling ourselves, I already know what's going to happen, but do we really? Because this attempt isn't the last attempt. It might be another rehearsal, it might be or a marathon, but you aren't exactly the same person you were the last time because time's moved on. Circumstances aren't exactly the same. We're older, your experience is different. Your knowledge is different. Your perspective is so different. There are too many variables in life for us to stand at the starting line and confidently declare what the finish is going to look like. And that's why I've started to love the phrase, that the title is, and how I've been trying to in the last, last week, the end of last week. Why not? Let's find out. Or if you really wanted to get a little extreme, F it, let's find out. There's a freedom in those words because, let's find out doesn't require you to guarantee anything. No, it doesn't. You don't have to say, I know I'm going to succeed. You don't even have to say, I know I'm capable of this. Sometimes that kind of confidence feels impossible, especially when you've recently struggled. Sometimes standing in front of the mirror trying to convince yourself that you completely believe something just creates another fight inside your head. Part of you says, I can do this. And another part immediately responds, Are you sure? So, maybe we don't fight that battle. Maybe we just say, throw our hands up. I don't know, and then we add, but I'm willing to find out. That is still courage, actually. Come to think of it, I think that might be one of the purest forms of courage. Walking forward without knowing, trying without guarantee, and that's so hard to tell your brain, like, "Shh, all right, we're going to try this. Just be with me." Giving yourself that permission to discover the answer through experience instead of just demanding that answer beforehand. Like, I need to know this before I even try that. Or last time, yeah, no, I don't want to do it because the guarantee wasn't there. But, I think, think about how many times in your life, it began that way where you're like, I don't know, let's just go. Maybe you applied for a job you weren't sure you'd get. Maybe you started exercising. Maybe you went back to school. Maybe you started writing, or you signed up for a race, or you walked into a gym and you're like, I don't belong here, or, you decided to chase something that from the outside looked a little ridiculous. I know I'm currently in that right now, and that's why I need a little bit of that. Why not? Let's find out. I've started to reassess my expectations for, sub 2:28, my PR in the marathon. And I'm still not sold. That ship still isn't gone. But right now, maybe I just need to have a little bit more of let's just start with another starting point. In February, I ran 2:46, way off from what I wanted to. But hey, lately my workouts have been going well. And the last couple of ones, it was like, let's just find out. And it took the pressure off. And I started running that marathon pace. And so I don't know, that's not going to be the guarantee. But if I can just go into that marathon that's coming up in October with that same mindset and even finish these last 8 weeks, of my training block, I think I'm going to have a better time at this. At some point there was a first step, and you probably didn't have the evidence yet that everything was going to work out. You created the evidence by going. That's what we sometimes forget. Confidence is not always something you have before the attempt. Sometimes confidence is something the attempt creates. I had to just say, let's find out. And sure enough, was confident enough to run those splits that I needed to. And I think you've been there. You listening right now, I think you've all been in that situation where you just got so over it that you're like, I'm just going to do it. And what happens? Most of the time, you actually get to do it and it's fun. You try something, you survive it, you learn, you adjust, and then you try again. And slowly your mind starts realizing, maybe we can do this. You don't have to figure out the entire future today. You don't have to be willing to say, why not? Let's find out. That's the only thing you have to be willing to say. And I want to be clear about something. This for sure is not about being reckless. It isn't about ignoring consequences of making terrible decisions because nothing matters. And I know when you first got into here and you're just hearing that and you're like, so this guy mean be reckless? Like just throw myself out there? No, it's not about that. It's quite the opposite. It's about recognizing when fear is disguising itself as logic. There are absolutely times when we should think carefully. There are decisions where we should prepare, research, plan, and understand the risk. But there are also moments when we've already done enough thinking. We've already analyzed it, and we've already imagined 20 different scenarios. We're already replayed the worst possible outcome, and eventually more thinking stops being preparation. It becomes avoidance. Sometimes there's no additional piece of information that is going to make you feel completely safe. Because the more we care about something, the easier it becomes to overthink. When something matters deeply to you, you want to protect it. You want to protect yourself from disappointment. You want to make sure the next attempt goes well. And without realizing it, you can start gripping the thing you love so tightly that you squeeze the joy out of it. Everything becomes a test. Everything becomes a result. Every day, every difficult day, it becomes a question about whether you're capable. And suddenly you're no longer participating in something you love. You're exhausted. You're constantly evaluating yourself. You're taking cheap shots at yourself, putting yourself down. What does this say about me? I have to prove that I can do this. That sucks. But if the mindset is, we'll switch it back around, let's find out. Then the attempt becomes information. It doesn't become the verdict. Maybe it works. Awesome. Maybe it doesn't. But now you know something about it now. You learned where you are. You learned what needs work. You learned what surprised you. You learned something that you never could have learned standing on the sidelines thinking about it. And you try again. I think there's something beautiful about living that way. Just trying. Not careless, not naive, curious, willing, open to being surprised by yourself. Because I wonder how many times we've decided what we're capable of based on old information, a bad experience, an old failure, something somebody told us years ago, a version of ourselves that doesn't exist anymore. That's what I'm struggling with. And yet we carry the information forward like it's permanent. Maybe it isn't. I'd like to think it isn't. Maybe the only way to update what you believe about yourself is to create new evidence. And the only way to create new evidence is by going to do something. That doesn't mean every dream works out. It doesn't mean every attempt is perfect. And it certainly doesn't mean believing something is possible guarantees that it will happen. That's not what believing in impossible means to me. No, it's not. It means refusing to make fear the final authority on your life. It means understanding that you may not know what you're capable of yet. And instead of being afraid of that uncertainty, maybe you become curious about it. Maybe you're standing in front of something right now, something you want, something you've been thinking about, something that scares you a little bit. And maybe you've been trying to answer every question before taking the step. Am I ready? Can I actually do this? What happens if it goes wrong? What will people think of me? What if I'm not capable of, as I hoped? I can't answer those questions for you. No, I can't. I can definitely help you to remind yourself, and that's about all the help I can, give you, but maybe you don't need to. Maybe I don't need to answer these questions. You don't need to answer these questions. Maybe today you need one question. Why not? Why not take that step? Why not give yourself the opportunity? Why not allow yourself to be a beginner? Why not risk discovering that you're capable of more than you thought? You don't need to know exactly where it goes. You don't need to guarantee. You don't need to feel fearless. You don't even need to have, completely, you don't even need to be completely believe in yourself. Just leave the door open, take the step, go see. And that voice inside you starts to asking, but what if we can't? What if I can't? Maybe just crack a little smile and answer. I don't know, but why not? Let's find out. I hope wherever you're at right now, I hope this episode really gets that spark going again. Yeah, I really do. It's definitely helped me this last week to really just embrace that, you know, why not? Let's find out. F it. Let's find out. I just want to let that you are still becoming. And remember, you are the only one stopping you.